Hello and welcome back to the channel. And we're going to do a kind of more light-hearted video today. We're both quite busy with work and whatnot, so we thought we'd just do something kind of quick, but also at the same time, food for thought, shall we say. And basically we're going to do the very, very controversial take that World War One was actually bad. I know, where else do you get such nuanced ideas as this? World War One was bad, I know. But jokes aside, we're going to break down how World War One really, really, really was the tragedy of the world. It really broke Europe, and just how much better the world really would have been had that conflict never occurred. And the first thing we're going to actually touch on is just how kind of shit and ugly it's made everything. How how it's just ruined the European romanticism. Just simply look at music and art and architecture on the in the years leading up to World War. It was beautiful. In fact, most of the cities that we marvel at in Europe are all pre-World War One constructions. The art, the romantic music, the music of Beethoven, Rachmaninoff, could never have been conjured in a time after World War One, because this was a world before the horrors of total war, before the horrors of industrial warfare. And that's the first key point we'll make, is that World War One broke the European kind of positive outlook on the world. Where can you find beauty when you've been in the trenches? When you've realised what man can do to another man? And this transfers beyond into this day and age. It's not the exact route. I mean, there's a lot of other subversive influences making our culture so kind of shit and lacking the quality and beauty that it once did. But World War One's definitely the starting point. World War One disenfranchised a huge generation of men, specifically white European men, the people that create the best culture, and it made them nihilistic and lose their value.
I think it's pretty clear when me and you have watched a few Turd Town videos, Christian bro. Like, you just see the brutalist architecture from the 60s and 70s. Milton Keynes looks horrible. I think although there's quite a big time gap between, we can say, the 60s and obviously 1914 to 1918, between World War One and then, but like you said, it's almost like a ripple effect, like the butterfly effect. It's like this one event has had an effect on so many different things, and the first thing that we spoke about is obviously just uglifying everything.
No, it's true. Like compare the music of, say, a Rachmaninoff in 1902, some of the most beautiful, optimistic music, and then compare similar, Russian classical music just after World War, and it's ugly and it's melancholy. There's almost this kind of brutalist style to it. All right, World War One truly killed the kind of positive view that we had in Europe and our desire for beauty, because we realized we weren't beautiful. That's kind of it. We realized we were not these enlightened beings because we were capable of doing this to one another. Now, the next big thing that doesn't happen without World War One is Germany. I thought you said this was a bad thing. No, kiddings aside. No. We won't delve into Nazi Germany. I don't even know if we're allowed to say that word on YouTube. Word it out probably after. We'll just call them 30s Germany for the sake of this. No, not having 30s Germany is big for the obvious reason we don't have World War Two and thus further destruction of the European peoples. We also lose not having World War Two is big for the world because World War Two killed nationalism. World War Two killed the idea that Europe could ever be patriotic or ever have collectivity between its people. The idea even of ethnicity died with World War Two in Europe. The idea that a people could be nationalistic and prideful in themselves and want to do something died with World War Two because of the negative connotations that the Nazis brought with them. So obviously that's one of the bigger reasons without it. And again, if in this World War One scenario of it not happening, we still have these strong states. You wouldn't need a Hitler if the German Empire remained. You wouldn't need these forces if you have the same Europe that existed before World War One.
An obvious one, you wouldn't have flipping the small little country in the Middle East ran by men with small hats and big noses that just casually commit genocide and are the exception to every single rule in IR and any political theory whatsoever. And that's a good thing, to be fair, that comes from that in terms of, like, if World War One hadn't happened, we wouldn't have that. Anyway, we wouldn't have the cool aesthetics, but let's go on to the next one. World War One caused the USSR, and who better to explain and rejoice at this fact than Christian bro, the USSR expert?
Now, obviously, World War One created the Soviet Union. This is obviously another negative consequence for Europe as a whole, just for the pure fact of the death toll inflicted by the USSR. Now, it's silly to imagine that there wouldn't have been a kind of expansionist Russia as it developed, especially in the 20th century, USSR or Imperial Russia. But for the most part, you wouldn't have a almost genocidal leadership leading this Russian empire, and you would have far more Russians and Ukrainians living there. You also don't have communism spreading, and I think that's the bigger one. Without communism spreading, you don't have the kind of uglification of the whole of Eastern Europe. You don't have this kind of Marxist infiltration that, again, is suicidal to a civilization, essentially. A lot of the ideas of Marx, how nihilistic it makes a people. You have, in this scenario without World War One, far more successful Russia, but let's also not forget a far more successful Germany to counterbalance, a far more prosperous Italy, France, Britain to again counterbalance. It would just be the same order that existed before World War One, not distorted. So you don't have a Russia domineering over the East because you still have a Habsburg Austria to buttress. You still have a Germany that can also push up against Russia. You don't have the kind of Europe that was created where it's just split between Russian interests or American interests, and essentially interests that aren't core European interests, right? So yeah, that's the big one again. No World War One, no Russian Revolution, no Soviet Union, and sadly, I hate to say it, no Stalin.
So you're basically saying a major consequence of the USSR existing because of World War One happening and it being so bad is that there are less white people in Russia because of the genocides, and secondly, also because of the imbalanced Europe that we got from the USSR domineering in the east side. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I wouldn't label them necessarily genocides. That might not be the most apt choice of words, but for whatever reason, communist inflicted deaths is probably the most appropriate term. And yeah, that's the big
okay.
issue.
Any jab at Stalin to piss you off makes me happy, Christian, bro. Obviously, the most pertinent one, which made World War One so horrible and why the world would be better off without without World War One happening in the first place, is the U.S. empire. The gay, the really gay. Now, again, I'll lay take on the prior points, or primary points, I should say, Christian, bro, and then I'll add any notes on that. So you go ahead.
Well, yeah. I mean, if World War Two was the nail in the coffin for Europe, actually, and the European nations being Germany, Britain, and France having kind of a say in global affairs and actually having a counterweight to US influence, World War One was certainly what facilitated it. If we don't have World War One, we don't have Britain losing half of its men. We don't have Britain having to get into a crap ton of debt to finance World War One, and it can at least prolong its existence as a major power. Now, in a kind of non-World War One scenario, perhaps we just see even a British-French alliance or a British-German alliance to counterweight America. But the brand point is you don't have World War Two, and then you don't have the creation of American imperialism. And I really don't need to emphasize enough just how bad American imperialism has been, specifically for Europe, right? I'm not going to go into kind of, oh, they cooed some Latin American dictator here. That's not what we do on this channel. I'm more talking about the kind of cultural poisoning of Americanism on Europe. Part of the reason what we started the video off with is the kind of uglification of Europe, the loss of European culture. And that's only exacerbated more by Americanism, right? It should be a stain on us, really, that we accept so many Americanisms into our daily life, that we've rejected so much of our tradition to embrace kind of consumerist crap American stuff, right? Our vassalhood, our diminishing to just a puppet of America, is caused at the very start by World War One, by our European suicide, allowing America to wrap its tentacles around us and essentially leave us at the mercy of who runs the US. And we all know who runs the US.
Going. We sure do. And obviously this one hits home for me, being Muslim, bro, of course, is in the fact that with World War One, we had the Ottoman Empire collapse. So if we didn't have World War One, the Ottoman Empire wouldn't collapse. Yay! But all that would actually mean, well, look, I'm not going to stand here and defend the Ottoman Empire. I think post-17th century, they were very corrupt and kind of poop. But regardless of that, you'd have a Middle East that is Middle Eastern in the sense that the tribalism, the fluid nature of the way Middle Eastern politics worked would continue. And, well, you wouldn't have the tiny little country that's kind of ruling and ruining the world right now. But at the very least, you'd have more peace in the region. And you wouldn't have situations where one state or one family in a specific state, such as Saudi Arabia, would come to dominate over loads of tribes and cause interconflicts and cause a situation in Yemen, etc., etc. Now, beyond that point, I want Christian Bro to relay it back to the consequences on Europe, but not just that, in terms of the consequences on world politics in general. Because at this point into World War One, if you're curious or know much about IR, we had the Westphalian system dominate, and that causes relative peace and a balance of power. However, as the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the balance of power in the Middle East also collapsed. And again, prior to this, we spoke about the US. That's also kind of what happened with the US. The US destroyed the balance of power in Europe, and the US kind of took over, if you will, and nobody could counterbalance that. Anyway, any points you want to make on this, Christian, bro?
Well, I'm surprised that as an Arab, you didn't mention Sykes-Picot. I mean, that's the number one woke Arab talking point.
Yeah, well, I'm not Edward
No,
Said, am I?
never, never. But the point being is Sykes-Picot is kind of emblematic of two things. Firstly, it's this like attempt at Europe just to kind of draw borders where they shouldn't be, right? There is no such thing as a Syrian state, right? Syria exists purely just to kind of formalize and organize, almost rationalize stuff. Very European in its way, but not very Arab, right? The Middle East worked because there weren't these borders between them. You didn't just have to force a bunch of people to have to live in a state, right? Shias would just live in a village near a village of Sunnis, and they weren't forced to live together because there was no kind of dictate forcing they were. The Ottoman Empire was fluid. But I say it's emblematic because it speaks to this larger post-World War One issue of the idea that every nation must have a state. This is kind of illogical to history as a whole. And it's a phenomenon that emerged out of World War One. Right, I've got nothing against, for example, the Czech people or the Polish people or whatever nation emerged out of World War One. It's more the fact that there became this kind of impulse and necessity for these states to have to exist, right? That's not how the world works. You have big powers, and big powers do what they want. We can't be just dying at the altar at the sovereignty of states that don't exist on their own accord. You see this played out perfectly with the Ukraine and Russia system. Again, I've got nothing against the Ukrainian people, and I've got nothing against them fighting against Russia. But the core point is there is no such thing as a Ukrainian state historically to that of the Russian state, which has always been a power. And this is a big phenomenon of World War One, the idea that every country has to have a state. And it's played out most worst in the Middle East, where there truly were never these states.
Sorry to be mean, Christian, bro, but you said a non-word. You said most worst instead of worstest. I'm joking. Mine was obviously the non-word. But yeah, that's the exact point. And I think a final kind of nail in the coffin for all of this is in the fact that...
Well, yeah, we'd have the power to keep them down if we hadn't, suicided ourselves in World War One and World War Two, right? Also, without USSR, you don't get communist China, of course, right? That's the kind of logic of why World War One not happening would be good. But yeah, I don't think anyone would argue that they would, with our kind of political persuasion, that there'd be a better world with communist China, right? Again, that's the big part of the point as well, is without World War One, it's a far more balanced world. It's not a unipolar world or a bipolar world as it's emerging now. It's a far more balanced world where you have European powers able to inflict, influence on the world. America's contained to a level. China's contained to a level, right? That's how the world probably should work, right? Not these big empires governing everyone. We need powerful states that have rich traditions keeping themselves going. And all of that's avoided without World War One.
World War One, as I mentioned earlier, basically destroyed the natural tendency of the Westphalian system that Europe brought about to maintain a balance of power within Europe. Once Europe destroyed itself, it couldn't, expand this very, very effective logic, by the way, of international relations and domestic politics, but also in terms of diplomacy and the relationship you could have with a neighboring country. Once Europe destroyed itself, it couldn't stop the rise of the US. Once Europe destroyed itself, it couldn't stop the rise of the USSR. It couldn't stop the rise of communist China. And that's what we have today. We have a completely out of balance world where these big powers can go about without any real checks and balances in IR. And unfortunately, and this isn't something we've necessarily dived deep into the video, but you then have institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, that really aren't institutions to balance power, but rather to maintain a certain agenda and quote unquote normalize a culture of international relations. That's my last finishing point I wanted to add there, Christian, bro. Anything you wanted to add, Habibi?
Well, I think we'll just end on the point. Hopefully, we've convinced you pro World War Oneers to change your mind here. Yeah, it was a slightly more kind of laid back, silly video, but I hope we've at least demonstrated some kind of good points to take away from this video. Obviously, this is a purely theoretical video. There is obviously a kind of element of time wasting, perhaps, in counterfactual histories, but I think it's important just to lay out really what the root cause of a lot of the ills we see in the modern world are. And they do come, sadly, from World War One. If you'd like to see us make a video on why World War One happened and more kind of sinister reasons it happened, please let us know, and it kind of puts into more context just how devastating this conflict truly was when you understand why it happened in the first place.
Yeah, 'cause believe it or
Yeah,
not, it wasn't
thank you
just
very
about an
much for watching.
archduke being assassinated. Surprise, surprise, right? The GCSE history teacher lied to you. Anyway, God bless you all. Thank you very, very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Take care.
Thank you.